open your Bibles to John chapter 6. That's where we're going to be. We were in John chapter 6 last week, and we're picking up in John chapter 6 this week, and we're going to start in verse 16 here in just a few moments. But I want to ask this question: who's ever been in a really bad storm before? And I'm talking even worse, who's been outside your home or your car when an intense storm hits? It's a very scary experience, and it's not just getting wet, it causes a lot of worry. I'll never forget when Hurricane Ian was just barreling up the East Coast this past fall. It was kind of around September. We're from the mountains, okay, so we're not used to tropical storms, we're used to snowstorms, and so this was a very different type of storm. And so we were texting our friends, we were texting our neighbors. It's like, hey, what should we expect? How do we prepare for this? What do we need to do? We were watching the news, we were seeing how Florida was being devastated, and the Cherry Grove Pier just up the Grand Strand from where we're at was just like totally taken out, and it was really scary. But the only thing that's worse than being in a storm is being outside when some heavy storm hits. And not just being outside, but imagine being on the water when a heavy storm hits. In that case, you're going to be desperate for two things. And this is really where we're going today with this encounter with Jesus walking on water and rescuing his disciples who are fearful and doubtful. There's two things that you need if you're on the water in a storm. You need a shelter and you need a shore. You need a shelter. The shelter is about protection. Because when a storm comes, the first thing we do is we run for protection. It might be just protection like of an umbrella. It might be get inside, get under get in a car or get in a house so that we could get out from under the storm and we can have a roof over our head. We can have a shelter. That's the first thing that we look to whenever just the bottom falls out and it starts like storming, right? So that's about protection. But then we don't just need a shelter, we need a shore. Because if you're on the water whenever the storm hits, the one thing that you want to get to is you want to get to the shore. And that's the one thing that's like your desire. Your desire, it's not just your destination, it's also your desire is like, can I get to the shore? And here's the sermon in a sentence that I just want to go ahead and give to you today if you're taking notes or maybe just want to make a mental note of this, and it's this: Jesus is our shelter and shore through every storm. Jesus is our shelter and Jesus is our shore through every storm. And so the invitation, it's very simple today. There's two ways that you could respond. I'm going to invite you to take shelter in the presence of Jesus above all. And I'm also going to invite you to fix your eyes on the shore of Jesus, not just as your destination in life, but also as your desire in life. And see, throughout the Bible, storms are like a metaphor for when hard times come. It's those times in life, and so a storm would be just a time in life when you've lost control. So if you really want to personalize this message and get the most out of the word today, just thinking about where have you lost control? Does your life feel like it's just out of control? And you say, well, you're going through a storm in that area. And a storm it's a season or a situation that's really hard. And in our passage today, Jesus' disciples are caught on the water in a storm, scared to death, fearing for their lives, unable to save themselves. And this is so relatable for all of us because we're all in one of three places. We're all either going into a storm in life, we're currently in a storm in life, or we're maybe coming out of a storm. And it's like, I don't want to relive that season. 2022 for our family, even for our church in a lot of ways, it was a hard year. Like Victoria and I, we've said, I don't want to relive 2022. And already in 2023, there's like parts, it's like, I don't ever want to relive that. It's like when you're coming out of a storm, you're just like, man, that was really, really hard. But no matter where you're at in going into, currently walking through, or coming out of a storm, all of us need a shelter, and all of us need a shore. And that's the significance of John chapter 6. It's where we are. And I do want to kind of set this up because the way that we're going to get the full story of what actually happened that stormy night at sea when the disciples were in the boat and they were fearing for their lives, we're going to get the full story by actually cross-referencing from some other unique perspectives in the New Testament. And so in case you're new to Scripture, there are 4 true and trustworthy accounts of the life and the ministry and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We call these the four Gospels, the four accounts of good news. And you may be like, why do we need four? Why couldn't we just simplify and just have one? And there's actually a really simple but helpful answer to that. It's because God cares about all people. And each gospel has a different audience in mind that would have made more sense to that audience. So the Gospel of Matthew was written to a Jewish audience. And so you talk a lot about Abraham, you talk a lot about prophecy, and God promising his people that he's going to send a Messiah, because the Jews cared a lot about those things, and so it made sense to them. But then you get to the Gospel of Mark, and it's like that's written to Romans. Romans are all about productivity and efficiency. And so you see a lot of action. You see a lot of production. You see a lot of immediately they went. And you see Jesus just getting the job done. It would have made, kind of like Americans, we care about getting stuff done. And the Romans, they cared about the same thing. And so that's the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Luke was for non-Jews. It was for Gentiles. And so the Gentiles, they didn't really care a whole lot about Abraham. And so what do you see in the family tree of Jesus? It goes back to Adam, because they do care about Adam. It's like that's where we came from. And it's a lot of outcasts, a lot of people who have been left out, less than, and lonely in life, and it appeals to them. And then you get to John, and John is for the whole world. It's just this global perspective on the life and ministry of Jesus. And when you look at all four of these accounts, they are complementary, not contradictory. And when you try to synthesize them, you can bring together what something, if you just get one account, it might feel like black and white, but if you bring all four together, or three together, or at least two together, it turns into high definition. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are 60% similar, but there is unique content in there. The Gospel of John is 90% unique. And the reason why is because John was the last gospel written, and he's like, there's some stuff that needs to go viral about Jesus' life and ministry. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to read about the disciples being caught in the storm, Jesus walking on the water, rescuing them from danger. This story is in three of the four Gospels. It's in Matthew, it's in Mark, and it's in John. And when we look at it from all three angles, it's like a high-definition experience. And that said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read John. I'm going to reference parts of Matthew and Mark as we go, just kind of for some running commentary. So, now we're ready. John 6:16. When evening came. Okay, so we see from Mark's Gospel that Jesus was dismissing the crowd. He had to tell them to go away. So when evening came, as Jesus was dismissing the crowd, his disciples went down to the sea. And Matthew tells us that the reason they went down to the sea is because Jesus made them. Jesus commanded them, you guys get in the boat and go into the sea. And that's significant because the disciples they're coming off of this unbelievable miracle. Jesus just turned a couple of barley loaves and sardines into a feast for thousands and thousands of people. And guess who that meal was delivered through? The disciples. So guess who probably got a lot of the credit? The disciples. They're like, oh, you guys are awesome. And they're just like, let's stick around. Let's get some more recognition. Let's feel some of this applause. And Jesus is like, you're missing it. Get in the boat and get out of here. It's not about you. And so he sends them on at his command. Verse 17, they got into a boat and started across the sea to Capernaum, about a 5 to 7 mile journey across the sea that's ahead of them. It was now dark and Jesus had not yet come to them. We know from John 6:15, we saw this last week, we also know from Mark's account that Jesus has withdrawn to a mountain to spend time with the Father. Because what they were trying to do after he turned the fishes and loaves into a feast for thousands is they were trying to elect him as their president. And they were trying to start the campaign. They were trying to print the t-shirts. It's Jesus 2024 or something like that. And they were trying to put the bumper stickers out. And Jesus is like, no, I didn't come to establish an earthly kingdom. I came to establish an eternal kingdom. And I'm not just going to stoop to be a political pundit in your schema of virtue or your kind of temporary felt need desires. I came to be the king of the world, not just the king of a few. And so he's like, no, you guys have told me what you thought. I need to hear from my Father. Everybody's given me their opinion on what I need to do. Now I'm going to go and I'm going to retreat and I'm going to get on the mountain and I'm going to listen to my Father and he's going to tell me and he's going to remind me what this is all about. And so what's a bit confusing about this is how Jesus quite literally is sending his disciples into what he knows is about to be a terrible storm. And it actually answers a question that we ask a lot. You've probably heard this question. Why do we suffer? Or why do we face storms? And you know, there's three basic reasons for that. We actually know why it happens. And we see one of those reasons in here, but the first two reasons why suffering happens, why storms come, is we do something sinful. I've heard it said before that if you break God's law will break you. It's that song, I fought the law and the law won. Like every time that you go toe-to-toe with what God says is right, what God says is best, what God says leads to flourishing, and you say, I know better, it's always going to come back on you, and you're going to find yourself in a storm. You can't outsmart God, you can't hide from God, and He knows best. And so when we break God's law, it ends up breaking us. So that's one of the reasons why storms in our lives, and some of you, you've been there. Like you've done something sinful, and it got you in a lot of trouble. And but another reason why storms come is because maybe not we do something sinful, but we do something senseless. You ever been there? I know I have. I've paid the dumb tax in a lot of areas of my life. But it's like you continually show up late to work and don't work hard while you are there. Or you just like make it your mission to give full vent to your opinions. Like unsolicited. It's like, no, but thank you for, like, no thank you. Like keep your free advice to yourself. Or it's like maybe you just talk too much and don't listen enough. Or maybe you eat too much. Or maybe you spend too much money that you don't have to impress people who honestly are going to exit your life as soon as they realize that you don't have something for them. Or maybe you spend your life surrounding yourself with toxic people. And if you are close to the body of Christ and you are listening to godly counsel, they would say, hey, listen, you need to have some boundaries and some borders in your life. And it's fine for you to be authentic, like your authentic self around them, but you don't owe them transparency. You don't owe those people access. Because every time they get into your life, it's just like, it's taking you like an elevator down to the basement. And then maybe there's something that's going on that you're just like, man, I probably shouldn't have done that. When you live that way, what happens? A storm enters your life. So there's sinful reasons why storms come, there's senseless reasons, but then there are sovereign reasons. So this is the mysterious will of God. God will sovereignly purpose a storm for you to face. And why is that? It's like, we don't like this. Because He doesn't always tell us exactly when it's going to come or how much of it we're going to experience. But here's a way to think about it. At the heart of the gospel, at the heart of the message of the Bible, is a king who advances his kingdom through storms of suffering that were not his fault. So how do you think his people are going to advance the kingdom? It's not by running from, but by recognizing that there's something in the storm that can move the mission forward. There's something in the storm that I can see Jesus more clearly and get more of His character. And if you think about it, like, how can you appreciate the gospel if you've never suffered? Or if you run from it at any sign that there's resistance ahead? It's like, think about those kids who just get everything they want. Until some of that good is actually withheld or taken, that kid's never going to become grateful. It's like you call them spoiled. You call them entitled, selfish, demanding. That's what happens when we, as adults, or any age and stage, we get everything that we want. God knows that it's going to make us rotten. And we're the same way. We get to a place of entitlement with the good things God brings, and like the disciples, after Jesus multiplied the fishes and the loaves, we go around and we take credit for it. It's like what is wrong with us? But it's what pride does to us. And interestingly enough, the disciples, they're thinking they're pretty awesome right now for that reason. And Jesus says, no, boys, I got to send you into a storm to remind you who this is all about. It's not, and by the way, Jesus never sends you into a storm to beat you up. He only and always sends you into a storm to bring you close. And that's what He's about to do with the disciples. He does the same thing with us. He sends us into storms. Why? To strip away our proud quest for joy, security, and identity outside of Him. In the storm, it's like it doesn't matter about the granite countertops. In the storm, it doesn't matter about your six-figure income. In the storm, it doesn't matter what you're driving. In the storm, it doesn't matter how many followers you have on social media. It just matters, am I going to get help and I'm going to get hope? And the only shelter is Jesus. And that's what he's trying to get us to see. So take a look at verse 18. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. And Mark tells us that Jesus somehow, some way, saw through the clouds, saw from the mountain that they were in trouble. And here's what I want to encourage your heart with. Jesus sends us into storms, but Jesus also sees us in our storms. You see, some of you feel as if God doesn't see what you're going through. And there's this lie that you're almost holding in tension. It's like he either cares but can't change it, or he could change it, but he doesn't care. What you're wrestling with is what theologians call the goodness of God and the greatness of God. And if you just see God as good but not as great, then you're never gonna go to him in times where you've lost control. Because it's like, oh, you're good, but you can't do anything about it. And if you only see him as great but not good, then you're not going to turn to him whenever you've lost control, because he might be able to do something about it, but he doesn't care enough about me to actually step into my situation and walk into my life. But there's great clarity in the storm. And that clarity is that, yes, Jesus will sometimes send us into a storm, but Jesus always sees us and knows all that we're going through. I want to give you an example of this. Amidst a storm of slavery and oppression in Egypt, back in Exodus chapter 2, verse 25, we read that God saw the people of Israel and God knew about their sufferings. In Psalm 56:8, we read that God has kept count of my tossings. He's put my tears in a bottle. Are they not in his book? So God literally sheds, he keeps a record of the difficult things that we go through. He cares that much about it. And so what I want to tell you is that Jesus cares and Jesus can. Jesus cares and Jesus can, and he sees you in your storm, and he even knows the type of storm that you're going through. So I shared that whenever we were preparing to start Coastway Church in 2021, our family and other families moved from the mountains to the beach. Like, I don't have a coastal complexion, but God does have a sense of humor. So here we are. I make sure that we always have sunscreen stockpiled. But what happens is we traded the type of storm that we go through. So we traded a snowstorm for a tropical storm. And what I learned through that is that everyone, everywhere will face a storm, but it won't always look the same. And so some of you, you're walking through a parental storm, and you're having a really hard time with your kids. And you're hoping that something's going to change. Some of you, you're walking through a storm at work, and something about your job is just leaving you really frustrated and really discouraged. Some of you, you're walking through an emotional storm, and your feelings are in the driver's seat. I heard it said, a mentor of mine recently told me, he's like, your feelings need to stay out of the trunk and out of the driver's seat, but they're welcome to ride along. Because at the end of the day, you've got to put the truth of Jesus in the driver's seat. You've got to listen to the feedback loop of your feelings, and you got to bring it all together to know what you're supposed to do. But maybe that's where you're at, is you're going through an emotional storm. Maybe you're going through a physical storm. Maybe you're going through a relational storm. Bottom line, if Jesus didn't care, then Jesus would never come. And what we're about to see is how Jesus comes to his disciples to meet them in their storm. And the scriptures are timeless and timely, so that means that if Jesus came to them, Jesus will come to you. And if Jesus met Peter and the disciples in their storm, Jesus will meet you in your storm. Verse 19, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles. So Matthew tells us that it was in the 4th watch of the night, which means that it's about 3 to 6 a.m., and they probably pushed out from the shore around 8 p.m., so they've been doing this for a really long time, not doing so great. And then Mark tells us this really interesting, kind of spooky detail that he meant to pass by them as he was walking on the sea. So hold on to that. But as all this was happening, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. And Matthew tells us that they said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. Did you know that when you are allowing your circumstances to control your perspective, that you will miss and mistake Jesus for something else? It's a ghost. Or it's just maybe like there's an area of your life and Jesus comes in close through a godly friend who tells you something that doesn't feel great, but it's true. And instead of seeing that as something that's for you, you see it as something against you and you say, that's harsh. You're like, well, Jesus is a ghost. He can't come to you in that moment. Or maybe like the bottom falls out financially and you're left wondering, what am I supposed to do about this? And the scriptures are telling us, hey, honor God first. Save to be wise, live on the rest to teach yourself contentment. And you've got the testimony of Scripture saying something like that. Maybe you've got some friends who care about you saying something like that, and you're like, no, it's a ghost. You know, Jesus doesn't know what he's talking about right here. But if we stick around, we see him for who he is. Verse 20, but he said to them, Jesus will always reveal himself to people who are looking for him and listening for him. And that's the only thing that the disciples get right is they keep listening and they keep looking. And because they do, Jesus appears to them and says, "It is I, do not be afraid." I want to tell you, our instinct in stormy seasons and situations is to try and save ourselves by rowing ourselves into the shore. Notice how it says they had rowed 3 to 4 miles at this point. You might think, well, that's pretty good, right? It's like, wrong. At least 7 of these guys were professional fishermen. They had seen these storms before. They had sailed this sea before. They knew it like the back of their hand. And they've been rowing for 8 hours, still miles from the shore. They should have been crossed by midnight and fast asleep in their Enos at this point, but they're still out there battling this storm that they can't overcome. And this is how salvation works, by the way. We work hard. We try to save ourselves. We fail miserably. We fear it's over. Then our eyes are finally opened and Jesus is there, waiting to rescue, extending his hand. So there's a little bit of conjecture right here, but it does animate the story and it helps us think about, how does salvation work? We're not sure how long Jesus has been out on the sea at this point. It's like that whole part about he meant to pass by them leaves you wondering if he was just close enough to where they could see him if they were looking, and he would leave it up to them on whether or not they would cry out for him to save. It's like he was giving them an option. You can keep rowing yourself, and you can keep trying hard, and you can keep building your resume, and you can keep relying on your own strength, and you can die if you want. Or you can come to the end of yourself and you can come to the beginning of me, and I can step in and I can actually save you from this predicament and from this storm that you find yourself in. As Psalm 50:15 says, "Call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you and you will glorify me." And that's about to happen. You see, as compassionate and powerful as Jesus is, he is a gentleman. He never forces salvation on anyone. But he always remains close enough to where if you see him, if you listen, if you look, he's ready to lead you home. And so the real question is not if Jesus cares. He's there. It's not if Jesus can. He's walking on the water, guys. It's will you humble yourself and cry out to him in faith and say, "You are my only help. You are my only hope. You are my shelter. I need to take refuge in you." Because the truth is, you will never look up and see Jesus, much less cry out in faith until you admit your utter inability to save yourself through the storm. And so up to this point, the disciples have cried out in fear, but then Matthew interjects this next dramatic element where Peter cries out in faith. And so this is going to be on the screen, but we're going to cross-reference Matthew 14:28 through 31 and one of the details that he includes. Verse 28. And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So here's how you can know that you're in the presence of Jesus, He's always inviting you to come a little closer. And this is encouraging because what are they? They're afraid. Jesus is not afraid of your fears. Because for them, the storm was bigger than them, but the storm was nothing to Him. And the very thing that freak us out and leave us fearful is the very thing that Jesus walks above and says, I got it. Just come close enough to me and take shelter in my presence. Fears and all, doubts and all. Jesus, you know you're in the presence of Jesus when He's calling you close. And that's why we want to have a culture of responsiveness to the preached word at Coastway. It's why we try to give opportunities whenever the word is preached. It's like, hey, maybe you need care. Maybe you need encouragement. Let somebody pray with you or talk to somebody in your community group when you leave about what is going on and what God's doing in your heart. Or ask the question about how could I get into a group of people who want to really take this seriously. And there's open doors right there. But verse 29, Jesus said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. Now here's the irony, is we don't need to overestimate ourselves right here. We do this a lot with scriptures. We read ourselves as the heroes. Like, Peter, when he walked on water, that's me, man. It's like, okay, well, just wait. Buckle up, Buttercup, because he's about to start sinking. Did Peter come to Jesus or did Jesus come to Peter? The only way that Peter could even be close enough to get to Jesus is if Jesus had performed the impossible and put Himself close enough to him. This is why Revelation 3, 19 and 20, it says, Jesus says, here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice, I will come in. So what He's saying is, I am close enough as your front door. All you got to do is open it up. But I came all these steps. I left the 99 to come and find you. You didn't come searching for me. And then verse 30, but when He saw the wind, He was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. By the way, you don't have to have some fancy, elaborate prayer for God to hear and respond. Peter launches, it feels like a buzzer beater prayer right before the game's over, right before he's about to sing. It's like, there's no way that this is going in. But sure enough, it lands right in the heart of God, and he responds. Verse 31. Jesus immediately reached out His hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And we're tempted to high side on Peter right here. Oh, Peter, weak faith, man. He's the only one out of the boat at this point. Everybody else is in the boat. It's like Peter did more than anybody else. And this is what I want to tell you. A little faith is better than no faith. A little Bible intake is better than no Bible intake. A little church attendance is better than no church attendance. A little bit of prayer is better than no prayer. A little bit of biblical community is better than no biblical community. A little bit of serving is better than no serving. A little bit of giving is better than no giving. And right here, even though Peter has a little and fails, Jesus has a lot and succeeds. And he meets him right here. And we see back to John 6:21. That was an important detail that helped us think about the story and almost picture us being there. But back to John 6:21. Then they were glad to take him into the boat. I bet they were, right? And immediately the wind ceased. The boat was at the land to which they were going. So here's the question is I'm going to assume that there's some fears that you have in your life. I'm going to assume there's some doubts that you're dealing with. What do you do with those when you're going through the storm with fears and doubts? There's two things that I want to put in front of you. First is a place to go, and the other is a step to take. The place that you go, here it is. You need to take shelter in the presence of Jesus. You need to take shelter in the presence of Jesus. When you're going into a storm, facing a storm, coming out of a storm, we see this in Peter's encounter with Jesus. Because in Matthew 14:28, Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And so verse 29, he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat. You might want to underline that if you take notes or write in your Bible. He got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. So two things to help you take shelter in Jesus. You got to get out and you got to cry out. First of all, you got to get out of the boat. Like Peter, every one of us have a scary step that Jesus is calling us to take. And for Peter, it was to get out of the boat and come to him even when his circumstances shouted, "Don't do it." And by the way, they'll always say that. And I just want to ask you, what is that for you? What is that scary step that Jesus is calling you out to take toward Him? And I'm going to check out an assumption right here. It doesn't make any sense, does it? Maybe it's surrendering your life to Jesus and being baptized and saying that I'm no longer in charge of my life, He is. I can no longer say myself, I'm done rowing and I'm ready to start depending. And the way you do that is you transfer trust from yourself to Jesus and you tell all your friends and you throw a party and we call it baptism. Maybe that's you. Or maybe it's reflecting forgiveness to someone who doesn't deserve it. That's kind of the idea of the gospel. That's the whole idea of Jesus with us. It's like, what should be the organizing principle of all of our lives? How could I be to others as Jesus has been to me? Like, that's renewal. That's healing. That's joy. Maybe it's receiving forgiveness, because maybe this weekend you did something again that you said you weren't going to ever do again. And maybe it's receiving the forgiveness. If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive our sins and to purify us from all unrighteousness. And you presume upon the purifying righteousness of Christ that is readily available to those who will receive it. And you get up and you go to war with sin one more time with Jesus at the helm. Maybe it's going to counseling with your spouse, because maybe there are some emotional, relational knots that you can't untangle and you know it. And what God is trying to do is step out of the boat together. Because if when you get married, you're holding hands, and if one gets out of the boat, both are supposed to go. That's the whole idea, and that's what's hard. And some people are like, I'm not ready. Well, I'm ready. And it's just like, let's do this together. And counseling is just one example of that. It's only as good as it points you to Christ. But maybe it's waking up 1 hour earlier than you currently are so that you can have unhurried communion with Jesus. That might be the godliest thing that some of us could do, is to slow down and to spend time in the presence of the water-walking, storm-calming, sin-forgiving God that is Jesus. And maybe the step is, you're here, great, come back. There's a lot of stuff this week that are going to try to talk you out of putting yourself in a setting like this same time next week. And I want to tell you, our hearts, all of our hearts, we need it. We need to be reminded of Jesus. So maybe it's literally, okay, I'm going to do one thing, and that's I'm coming back to church next Sunday. And whatever it is, just like Jesus met Peter on the stormy waters that night, He will do the same for you today and prove to be a very present help in times of trouble when the waters roar and foam and your circumstances are shouting, quit. And sure enough, anytime we take scary steps of obedience, the storms feel stronger and we're prone to start sinking. And then we see, beginning to sink, Peter cried out. This was Matthew 14:30. Lord, save me. And Jesus immediately reached out His hand and took hold of him. And here's the next way that we take shelter in the presence of Jesus, is we don't just get out of the boat, we cry out in faith. You see, up to now, this was the most desperate moment in Peter's life. There's no doubt that he was full of doubt and thought it was over. But the good news about doubt is how it doesn't disqualify us from the shelter of Jesus. As we've talked about, our savability has less to do with the quality of our faith and more about the object in which we place it. You want to know why Peter survived? It's because he called out to Jesus and not the disciples. And if you're looking to some friendship, if you're looking to some dating relationship, if you're looking to your spouse to save you, to be your life preserver, guess what? You're going to sink, and you're probably going to take them with you. You need to take your focus off of other people, and you need to put it on the one who alone can rescue you from the storm, and you need to cry out to Him, not them. Save me. Save me. Understand who Peter's crying out to save him right here. You got to understand who you're talking to when you cry out in faith to the cosmic King of creation who can calm the storm you're facing. All throughout the Bible, God's presence meant safe passage through dark and stormy waters. And so when Peter cries, "Lord, save me," he's crying out to the God of Genesis 1:2, who from the beginning was hovering over the face of the waters, establishing His authority over the sea and the storm from the very beginning. Peter's crying out to the God of Genesis 7:18, who when the waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth in the flood, He made the ark float on the face of the waters. And you got to understand, the ark was God's shelter of salvation through the flood, and there's a direct connection between the ark floating on the water, which brought salvation to Noah's family, and Jesus walking on the water, bringing salvation to Peter, and bringing salvation to you and I through the storm. Peter's crying out to the God of Exodus 14:21 and 22, who commanded Moses to stretch out his hand over the sea, and who then drove the sea back. And the people of Israel went into the sea on dry ground, and they experienced salvation from suffering and from death and from oppression. And Moses stretching his hands over the sea was a foreshadowing of Jesus outstretching His arm to Peter and to you and me. Though you're about to perish, God's power and presence will lift you up and lead you through. Just like it did with Moses and the Israelites, just like He did with Peter, He will do it for you today. Do it again, Lord. And Peter's crying to the God of Isaiah 43:2, who promised that when you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. And right here, Jesus kept that promise to Peter. And if you cry out in faith, even a little faith, even a weak faith, even a puny faith, He will do the same for you. Where do you need to cry out in faith? And I'll help you out a little bit here. You need to cry out where you're about to tap out. Where are you tempted to quit? Where are you tempted to say, it's not worth it anymore? That's the very area where you cry out in faith, not in fear, and you look to Jesus to lift you out. Did you notice how Jesus' words to His disciples were not, "The storm is over, but it is I, do not be afraid"? And the reason Jesus said this is because He was out to calm a greater storm. If you look closely, you see two raging storms in this story. There's the storm that was outside on the sea, and then there's the storm that was raging inside of you and me. One was the sea storm, the other is the sin storm. And Jesus always deals with the worst storm first. And it's the storm caused by our sin, because what does sin do? Sin separates us from God, and it sentences us to death. And it's doing both of those things in this moment with the disciples, because sin is what kept the disciples rowing into their death, depending on themselves, instead of rowing toward Jesus in prayer. Sin is what caused the disciples to fear that God had left them in the storm. And what does Jesus show up and say to calm the greatest storm? He doesn't say, "Wind and waves, stop," immediately. He says, "It is I," to His disciples, speaking to the storm that was raging inside of them, saying, "Peace, be still. It is I, do not be afraid." In this moment, Jesus is calming the greater storm first, because He's coming to us as the shelter who not only can save from death at sea, but who can save from the death of sin. And how does He do this? Well, it's very clear. He does this on the cross. On the cross, Jesus willingly stepped into the ultimate storm under the ultimate waves of sin and death. He sacrificially plunged into the only storm that can truly sink us, the storm of our sin caused by our rebellion. And it was a storm so fierce that it could only be calmed if Jesus was swept away. But because He was swept away, I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor demons, nor storms, nor shadows, nor sin can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. And that's why He says, "I'm here, you don't have to fear." Where do you go in the storm? Where do you go? You go to the shelter of Jesus' presence. But next, what do? You fix your eyes on the shore of Jesus. You got to fix your eyes on the shore of Jesus. So there are several miracles in this story, and one of the miracles, it's kind of trippy, is that somehow as soon as Jesus stepped into the boat, it was like Shazam. The disciples safely arrive at their destination, though they were still miles out. In verse 21, John 6:21. Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the wind ceased. The boat was at the land. That means they made it to the shore that they were deeply desiring. It was their destination to which they were going. And so what we see is that as the disciples were tirelessly rowing, there's nothing they wanted more than the shore. It's where they wanted to be, and it's what they were so desperate to finally be able to see. And can I show you something? The same time that the disciples stopped trying to get to the shore on their own and instead fixed their eyes on Jesus is the same time they made it to the shore and realized that they were going to live. And there's a very simple explanation for why this is, the order of this. It's because Jesus is the ultimate shore. He's where their hearts were desperately longing to be the whole time. And you see, Jesus is not just the shelter who saves, He's the shore who satisfies. And if you just view Jesus as the shelter, you're going to relate to Him like you do your insurance agent. Whenever there's a flood, whenever there's damage done, you're going to call Him up and say, all right, let's cash in on that policy. Remember, it's your job to take care of me. But if you see Him as your shelter and your shore, you're going to relate to Him as your closest friend and your truest fulfillment. And so for us today, the shore serves as a metaphor for our desired destination through the storm. And there's many different shores that we fix our eyes on. It's like if you're going through a money storm, maybe your shore is a raise. Maybe your shore is a promotion. Or in South Carolina, maybe you're trying to win the lottery. Whatever it is, but here's a plot twist. Did you know that wealthy people still have problems? More money, more problems. There it is. Maybe you're going through what you would consider a relational storm. You desperately want to marry, but nobody's in sight. And you're just like, I think the shore for me is that dating relationship. You know, it's that 6 foot tall, dark, and handsome life preserver that's going to float by me, and I'm going to latch on, and somehow that's going to take me in. But actually, you're probably going to take him down. Because lonely, insecure, unhappy single people end up becoming lonely, insecure, unhappy married people. It's a heart problem, not a circumstance problem. Jim Carrey, probably didn't expect me to quote him today. I think everybody should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of so they can see it's not the answer. But the answer is when you come to see that the true and ultimate shore is Jesus Himself. And that's why Jesus met them in the storm instead of on the shore, because He's the one that they really needed. You think you need to do something like run aground on that physical shore, and then you'll be okay, but what you really need, more than the end of the physical shore, is to fix your eyes on Jesus as your ultimate shore. And you're just like, what does this even look like? I'm glad you asked. If you're going through a parental storm, Jesus is your shore when your deepest longing is not to see your kids do what you want, that would be nice, but it's to see your kids do what Jesus wants. Jesus is your shore in your parenting. You're going through a storm at work. Jesus is your shore when you show up to a job you don't enjoy with people you may not like and still give it your best because you're working for the Lord, not for some man or woman. You're going through a relational storm. Jesus is your shore when you care more about what God says and thinks about you than any other group or person, even if it means ridicule or rejection. If you're going through a physical storm, Jesus is your shore when your hope through sickness is not even that you recover, but that you more fully desire and display the life that sickness can't touch, pandemics can't threaten, and death can't take. You're going through an emotional storm. Jesus is your shore when you choose to believe what He says as true and real, despite the way you feel. And I want to ask you a simple question. What is your shore through the storm? What is it that you want most? Is it for your stormy circumstances to change? Or is it the certainty that Jesus is going to walk with you through them? You see, what this story tells us is that your life can be terrible, but you can still be at peace. Your life can be really, really hard. And you can deal with fear, you can deal with doubt, you can deal with anxiety, but you can still somehow have peace because the shelter and the shore of Jesus. And so what do? Well, let me ask you this. Where are you at? Are you going into a storm? Are you going through a storm? Or are you going out of a storm? Regardless of where you're at, you're in one of those three places. Here's what we do to make Jesus our shore. We fix our eyes on Him, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before Him endured the cross, despising its shame, and is now seated at the right hand of God and has all authority and all rule and all power over that storm. And so it's interesting in Matthew's account, Matthew 14:33, it says that after the physical storm calmed, the disciples worshiped Jesus and said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So regardless of where you're at, any of those three places, going into, walking through, coming out of a storm, here's what you do. You worship Jesus. You worship Jesus by taking shelter in His presence and saying, "Jesus, I'm done trying to row myself to safety. I'm going to look to You and I'm going to depend on You." And then you fix your eyes on Jesus as the shore and you say, "Jesus, You are all I need for life and happiness, even if the storm doesn't stop." Let me pray for you.